You may have noticed that your car does not behave the same on the Nordschleife as it does on other tracks in ACC. That is in part due to the track itself, of course, with its jumps, bumps and elevation changes. But it's also very much due to the car setup, at least for GT3s, which we will focus on in this video. And that's because there are some GT3 settings that are very different on the Nordschleife than on any other track. So today, let's talk about what these differences are, how they affect your car, and what you can do about it. Building setups for the Nordschleife is different than on other tracks, and I don't think anyone has fully figured it out yet. But I will do my best to give you some tips so you can get started building your own setups for the Nordschleife. I will also provide you with 2 setups at the end of the video, one for the McLaren 720S Evo and one for the BMW M4, which you can use if you want to. You can also just build or adjust your own setup for the car of your choice along with me using the tips I provide. If you haven't seen my general setup guide video yet, I'd highly recommend you check it out, as I will reference it at times during this video. In it, I explain in a lot of detail how to start from a baseline setup and adjust based on your preferences, skill level and driving style. I'm linking it for you right now on screen and in the video description. That video is specific to building your setups for normal racetracks, however. The Nordschleife is anything but normal and unlike any other track in ACC right now. Not only because of how long one lap is and how narrow the track feels. As I said, it also has major elevation changes, huge bumps and even jumps in places. That alone makes the track drive very differently. But still, if you try to run a setup from another track on your GT3 here, you might have noticed that it behaves even more weirdly than you'd think. That's because there are special regulations in place at the Nordschleife. Namely, there is a minimum ride height imposed on your car here. Normally, GT3s sit quite low to the ground, around 50 to 55 millimeters in the front. Now just look at the famous carousel and think what would happen if your car was still that low. You can probably hear the scraping of your front splitter against the concrete already. So on the Nordschleife, the minimum ride height for most cars is at least 70 millimeters by regulations. That's still quite low considering the track, but it already does affect the cars in a major way. GT3s rely a lot on their aerodynamics. With the ride height of the car being higher, the downforce the car can produce is reduced significantly. Let's take a look at an example to really understand what's going on. Here is the aero page of my McLaren setup for other tracks. You might have seen me build that in the setup guide I mentioned in the beginning. Notice the ride height in the front is 50 and the rear 73 millimeters. For future reference, that is 23 millimeters of rake, which is the difference between the front and the rear ride height. Now look at the same setup screen on the Nordschleife. The front ride height sits at 70 millimeters and can't go any lower. If I were to go with the same 73 millimeters in the rear, my rake would now only be 3 millimeters. That would affect my car's rotation massively, as you might know, so I naturally tried to replicate the same rake I had on the other setup. So with 23 millimeters of rake, I would be at 93 millimeters in the rear. It's at this point you might notice that this is not possible because the maximum rear ride height is 90 millimeters on the McLaren here. Which is less than on other tracks, by the way, where it can go up to 105 millimeters in the rear. This is different on every car, by the way, but on most the rear ride height adjustments are also changed in different ways. So the regulations don't seem to want us too low to the ground, or to run very high rake apparently. But you also won't want to run as high rake here as on other tracks, even though on some cars you actually could. You can try, but I can tell you that it doesn't feel good on the cars I've tried. The car will feel very oversteery and snappy. So we have to look at other setup changes to make the car work. I'd start with the rear ride height slider somewhere in the middle, maybe a little bit lower. For the McLaren, I started at 80 mm in the rear. I then went out to test the setup for a bit, and I'd recommend you do the same to really get a feel for how the setup performs. If you feel like the setup is too aggressive for you and oversteers, try reducing the rear ride height. That should help quite a bit. Most likely that will not be the case, however. You will probably notice instead that the setup understeers quite heavily, and that's to be expected with a lot lower rake. It mostly occurs at higher speeds though, which is important to note. So if just adding more rake isn't the best option, let's take a look at what else we can do. What we need is more front grip, especially in high downforce sections. We will never be able to produce the same amount of grip in the front as on other tracks because of the higher ride height, however. There just isn't as much downforce possible if the front splitter is farther off the ground. That's just physics. Front splitter is a good first thing to look at, however. On some cars, the front splitter is adjustable. While it doesn't do a lot, if you can adjust it, I'd recommend maxing it out here. For the McLaren, that already made the front grip feel a bit better. If you can't adjust it, or even if you can, the other option to increase front aerodynamic grip is to shift the aero balance more towards the front. And that's our main adjustment on the Nordschleife actually. Reducing the rear wing to shift the aero balance more to the front and therefore increasing front grip quite a bit. I'd start by putting the slider at 50%, which for the McLaren is 6, and start testing. You should already feel your car rotate better at mid to high speeds. One added benefit is that you will also be faster in the long straight sections on the Nordschleife, like Kesselchen and the Döttinger Höhe. Now it's up to you to figure out how your car behaves now. Do you feel like it already doesn't have enough rear grip in high speed sections? Then feel free to increase the rear wing again until you feel comfortable. It's more likely, however, that you still feel like your front grip is lacking and you understeer more often than not. In that case, I would try to go even lower with the rear wing. For me, going down to 4 with the McLaren felt good and I left it there. See what works for you, and don't worry if you're not running minimum wing like some pro drivers seem to do right now. The setup you're building should be perfect for you and no one else. With the rear wing set for now, you might still have some understeer problems. Here is where you can increase your rake, so your rear ride height, a little bit more. Be careful, however, as this will also affect the car balance at higher speeds. If you feel like the higher rake is necessary for low speed rotation, however, you can of course increase rear wing at the same time again to counteract the change in rake. For me, on the McLaren, it didn't feel great to increase rake anymore, so I left it at 80. There is one more setting we can explore for better rotation, however, which is in the mechanical grip section. As you might know from my setup guide video, I run the Meta setups, which are very soft in the springs. For the Nordschleife, however, I found the rear wheel rate to be an excellent adjustment option to get better front grip and therefore rotation out of my cars. Higher rear wheel rate means stiffer springs and therefore less compression in the rear under load. This leads to more of the car's weight on the front, so you get more grip there. On the McLaren, increasing this a bit helped with general rotation, but too much made the car really unstable at low speeds. This led me to only increase the rear rate by 2 clicks. On the BMW, however, I was able to increase this a bit further, as you'll see at the end. Even though in my general setup guide video I advised against adjusting the rear rates in the beginning, for the Nordschleife I feel like it's a very good option to fine-tune the car if adjusting aero is not enough. And that's already all the settings I would adjust from the baseline setup you started with. So to recap, start by setting the front ride height to the minimum if it's not already there. If adjustable, max out the front splitter. Set the rear ride height and the rear wing to the middle of the slider to start with. Adjust rear ride height and wing based on your test driving. Higher rear ride height and lower wing will make the car rotate more, but can also lead to oversteer. Remember that lower rear wing benefits you more than higher rake because of the speed advantage on straights. So prioritize lower rear wing instead of higher rear ride height. If the setup still understeers, especially at lower speeds, try increasing the rear wheel rate in the mechanical grip section. With these adjustments, your setup should already feel a lot better than what you started with. Yes, your car will never feel and behave the same way on the Nordschleife as it does on other tracks. But you can still get it to where it feels right for you. If this helped you out, please let me know by hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel, as that massively helps me out. As promised, here are my setups for the McLaren and the BMW. Feel free to pause at any time and take a look. By the way, as I said in the beginning, all of what I've talked about today applies mainly to the GT3 class. GT4s and GT2s are mostly unchanged on the Nordschleife, which means you can run your usual setups here without much problems. You can, however, still use the methods in this and the general setup guide if you notice any specific problems. I really hope that I was able to explain to you today why your GT3s feel so different on the Nordschleife. If you have any questions or further advice, put them in the comments. Have fun on the Nordschleife. If you want to see me struggle on it, feel free to check out the video on screen right now. Thank you so much for watching. I've been HD Racing. See you next time.